So this is the session for Brother LeFevre. At the end, we will have a closing prayer by Leanne Morgan. And we're good. So David A. LeFevre is a teacher, writer, and independent scholar with a great love of BYU. He has taught Seminary Institute, BYU Adult Ed programs, and Education Week. He has been published in several books and journals, writing on every standard work, but with the Joseph Smith translation being a particular area of focus. He works for Microsoft, writes a blog on scriptural topics, and currently teaches a religion adult ed class in Monroe, Washington, on the Doctrine and Covenants. He and his wife, Melanie, have 7 children and 6 grandchildren, and live on a farm in Maltby, Washington, with their horses, goats, turkeys, and chickens. So take it away.
Thank you. It's awesome to be here tonight, and my daughter and I drove up yesterday from Washington, and the drive was acceptable. Somebody said, "How'd the trip go?" I said, "No accidents." So I want to talk about Joseph Smith translation of the Bible and its impact on Joseph Smith himself personally. The translation of the Bible for him was a fascinating experience that he went through over a 3-year period of time. It was really a revelatory experience in every way. For Joseph Smith, translation was revelation, and revelation was how we learn things from God. So this whole Bible translation experience was really the way that God tutored Joseph Smith and trained him to be a prophet, as we'll take a look at. Now, a long time ago, I had a class with Robert Matthews. Some of you might know Robert Matthews' name. I would call him the original scholar on the Joseph Smith translation. He's one of the guys all started on this. And he made a statement about how the Doctrine and Covenants was related to the Joseph Smith translation. But he hadn't really done a lot of work on that to figure that out. So I sat down one day and I said, well, let's look at the period of the Joseph Smith translation and how it actually relates to the Doctrine and Covenants. So these are all the sections of the Doctrine and Covenants in the year that they were received. This is the period of time when the Joseph Smith translation was received. 55% of the Doctrine and Covenants overlaps with that period of time. That's pretty significant. If you look at it a different way, and here's a chart, and don't worry that you can't read all the little numbers, because that's not the important thing here. This chart shows when he was working on the Old Testament, the blue, and when he was working on the New Testament, the green, and then when he was editing the New Testament there at the bottom. And let me turn this on, so it makes it easier. So as he's working through the translation here, like right here he's doing the Old Testament, look at the revelations that come about. And then there's some stragglers there. And then here, New Testament revelations. These revelations here are for when he was in Missouri for the first time. They were determining where Missouri was and where Zion was and all of those things. But you'll notice that every time there's revelation, every time there's Doctrine and Covenants, there's revelation. And when there's no revelations, he's not doing the work. Is that an interesting correlation? Robert Matthews said, I believe that this is not a coincidence, but a consequence. It was Joseph Smith's study and translation of the Bible that set the stage for the reception of many revelations on the doctrines of the gospel. There is an inseparable connection between the new translation of the Bible and many of the revelations that constitute the book of Doctrine and Covenants. So with that correlation in mind, let's take a look at how this began. If you're familiar with the work on the Joseph Smith translation, it kind of fits into this period of time in church history. I've got the Book of Mormon being published and the church being organized there in 1830. Then we come along in May, and they have the first church conference in June. Now, if you're reading this chart, there's Harmony, Fayette, and Colesville, and the yellow bars show where Joseph Smith was at the time. So he's in Harmony first, then he comes to Fayette for the organization of the church. He goes back to Harmony, goes to Colesville for a visit, then he's back in Harmony most of the time. Quick trip down to Fayette for the first church conference on June 9th. Then he's back in Harmony, and then he's in Colesville. Sometimes we don't realize that Joseph Smith was actually living in Harmony all this time. And he owned a house there that he was buying from his father-in-law, Isaac Campbell. And so that was his house. That was his place of residence, and he went there as often as he could, obviously. This period of time right here is when the Joseph Smith translation starts. The date on the manuscript is just June. We'll look at that in a second. But trying to narrow that down, when was Joseph Smith in Harmony with Oliver Cowdery, and they were in a position where they could write? It's between that June 9th conference, and he gets back about the middle of June, and when they go to Colesville at the end of June. So there's about a 2-week period. We can narrow it down that much. Just can't get more specific than that, unfortunately. Here's a look at that manuscript, and you can see right here at the top, it says, a revelation given to Joseph the Revelator, June 1830. And this is how it begins. There's an interesting narrative Richard Bushman kind of brought out in his history of Joseph Smith Rushstone Rowland. It says, this period of time for Joseph, after he translated the Book of Mormon, and after the church was organized, he begins to wonder what his next project is. And he doesn't really know. He goes back to Harmony, and he's working his farm, and he's kind of done what the Lord asked him to do. He's done. And he wonders what is going to be next for him. And this is what tells him what's next. As this comes to him in June 1830, he realizes through this revelation what's to be next for him. And here's what it says at the second to last verse in this revelation, what we call Moses chapter 1, which he calls just a revelation. In the day when the children of men shall esteem my words as naught, and take many of them from the book which thou shalt write, meaning Moses, the Lord speaking to Moses, behold, I will raise up another like unto thee, and they shall be had again among the children of men, among as many as shall believe. Joseph learned that his next project was the Bible. That as a prophet, as a translator, as a seer, that was the next thing he was going to do. And on this manuscript, on this first page, when they write this revelation of Moses, the very next thing he writes is Genesis chapter 1. And that begins the whole project. So he saw this very much as part of his calling. Now, what did he learn along the way? I've got several examples that I'd like to share with you tonight. This first one is the nature of Satan. What did he learn about Satan? Now, Joseph Smith had learned something about Satan in the first vision. He had an encounter with him. He had learned a little more along the way. But in section 29, on about the 26th of September, maybe just before the 26th of September is when that was revealed, you'll see this section in there, verses 35 to 39, where he uses some of these words about Satan. That man is an agent unto himself because of what Satan did. The devil rebelled against God, saying, give me your honor. The third part of the host of heaven turned the devil away. The Satan was thrust down, and the devil should be there to tempt him in. That was his role. So that's kind of summary of what he learned. Now, if you were reading section 29, and that's all you had, you would think that this was brand new information. This is the very first time he's ever learned this. But it's not, as it turns out. And section 29 is a marvelous piece of revelation. If you haven't looked at it recently, wow. Look at everything, sections 1 through 28, everything leading up to that. And then look at 29, and you'll see it has a completely different tone. It is absolutely unique. It covers the events of the last days and does things that no other section that Joseph Smith received, no other revelation he's received so far looks like section 29. It is really, really unique. And this is part of that uniqueness. But it's not where he learned it. Because in July of 1830, so just a couple months before this, he had translated Moses, what we call Moses chapter 4, Genesis chapter 3. And in that, he had learned the same doctrines about Satan. Almost word for word. Look at those comparisons there. Satan said in Moses, give me thine honor to the Lord. Satan rebelled against God and was cast down. His role was to destroy the agency of man, to deceive and to blind men, and to draw them away after him. So he learns this first in the Joseph Smith translation, and then he reveals it to the church through section 29. And it's enhanced a little bit in the process of doing that. On some other occasions, besides these revelations, Joseph Smith taught some things about Satan that are interesting. He said the devil has no power over us only as we permit him. The moment we revolt at anything which comes from God, the devil takes power. So this is similar to what he learned there. Satan cannot seduce us by his enticements unless we, in our hearts, consent and yield our organization such that we resist the devil if we are not organized, so we would not be free agents. And then the last one, Satan was generally blamed for the evils which we did. But if he was the cause of all of our wickedness, men could not be condemned. The devil cannot compel mankind to evil. All was voluntary. Those who resist the Spirit of God are liable to be led into temptation, and then the association with heaven is withdrawn from those who refuse to be made partakers of his glory. Those words come from Moses. He learned them in Moses, but he taught them all throughout his life as a result of this experience he had with the Joseph Smith translation. Let's take another look at section 29, because I wanted to call this out. this is really the first section that has a tie-in with the Joseph Smith translation. There are lots of others. One of the things that I've noticed as I've studied the words of early books of Moses in section 29 is there's other phrases that just get injected in. They first come from the JST, and then they end up in section 29, and fascinatingly, they end up no place else. They're not in other places in Doctrine and Covenants, they're not biblical, they literally are only in those two places, Moses and section 29. These are some examples. The word of my power, that phrase is not used any other place in Scripture except Moses chapter 1 and 2 and section 29. I gave unto him that he should be an agent unto himself. The concept's taught in the Book of Mormon, but those words are only used in these two places, Moses 3:17, section 29, though it is subsequently used in a couple other places in the Doctrine and Covenants. And then to pray or to have faith in the name of mine only begotten is unique to this thing. Certainly the phrase only begotten Son is not unique. We see that in the Book of Mormon and the New Testament and other places. But to put those phrases together like that is unique to these two places, only in Moses, only in section 20. So it's really fun. You get a chance to look at the unique phrases of section 29. There are lots of them. Okay. Now we'll talk about Zion. Zion was obviously a major focus for Joseph Smith, and this whole idea of Zion in New Jerusalem. When he first learns about it, when he first has revelations using the word Zion in the Doctrine and Covenants, he's using them in a way that other Christians use the word up in his day. He doesn't really have a unique understanding at that point. If you were to ask a Methodist or a Presbyterian or something in Joseph Smith, say, what does the word Zion mean? They would give you one of two definitions. They'd say it's either another word for Jerusalem, just another name for the city, or it's a holy community, a group of people who come together in a Zion-like fashion. And that's all they ever thought about it. The word New Jerusalem comes from the book of Revelation. And so there was an understanding that that was a city that would come down. Joseph Smith had translated the Book of Mormon, so he knew from Ether that it also meant a city that would come from the Lord in the last days. But he didn't know much more than that. So as he's starting this experience, this is what he's going to learn. In 1829, there's an experience where Joseph Smith, again, he's in Harmony up in Fayette. There's a man named Hiram Page who has a seer stone and he's seeing revelations. And Hiram Page learns a number of things. One of the things he learns is that he learns the location of the New Jerusalem through his seer stone. And he writes this down and he has all these writings. Now, Hiram Page later declared that his writings were false. Joseph said that his translation was of the devil, not his translations, revelations were of the devil. And so they destroyed those. I kind of wish we had them, because it would be interesting to see where he said New Jerusalem was. We don't know. Nobody ever talks about what Hiram Page said. But as a result of that, then Joseph comes up to Fayette and they have another revelation, and he has a quote where it says this, and this is section, sorry, I get the right one, section 28, here we go. Now behold, I say unto you that it is not revealed, and no man knoweth where the city shall be built, but it shall be given hereafter. So Hiram Page doesn't know anything. His revelations are false. But we'll find out later where the New Jerusalem exactly is. So in early December, there we go, bear through that. In early December of 1830, he receives Moses chapter 7. And in Moses chapter 7, as you know, he has the vision of Enoch, Enoch's city, and Zion. And they learn all kinds of things about Enoch's people. Both the people and the city are called Zion in Moses chapter 7. Zion is taken up into heaven. Their enemies fear them because of all the things they do. And all those things are part of that initial revelation. And there's more. On the 2nd of January, so just literally a few days later, he has Revelation section 38, where the Lord throws this statement in there. I am the same, introducing himself, right? Christ is explaining who he is to the people receiving this revelation. I am the same which have taken the Zion of Enoch into my own bosom. Now, unless you're Joseph Smith, or his scribe, you're the only ones that know, Sidney Rittman, you're the only ones that know what that even means. When section 38 comes out, the rest of the church is scratching their head going, the Zion of Enoch? What's that? They've never heard of it. He just learned about it a few days before. But the Lord puts it in there because they know it, right? They know what he's talking about, and eventually the rest of the church learns it too. And then on the 7th of March, a couple months later, then DC 45 teaches that the righteous are to gather to Zion, and the wicked will be afraid, which is definitely language from Moses. It continues on. December of 1830 is the first time, again through Moses, that Joseph Smith learns that Zion and New Jerusalem could be considered equivalent terms. Moses chapter 7 tells him that that's where God's abode is, and those two terms are equivalent and the same. 1830. In 1831, February of 1831, is the first time New Jerusalem is mentioned in the Doctrine and Covenants there, as you can see, section 42. It's mentioned other times after that, but that's the first one. And then not till September 1832, so almost 2 years after the Moses experience, the first time the D&C says those are the same terms. So the church learns something Joseph Smith learned 2 years earlier about how Zion and Jerusalem are the same. And then finally, as this continues, in 20th of July, 1831, they learn that Independence, Missouri is going to be the location of Zion, the New Jerusalem. But this concept evolves, and if you get a chance, there's another lecture right now, so it's too bad you have to stay here. But Tom Lynn, I forgot her name. Wait, I want to get it wrong. She was really nice to me. Tom Lynn Rutherford, there we go. Tom Lynn Rutherford is doing a talk on Zion right now, and it's a great article, so pick up the book and read what she wrote about Zion. Because she talks a lot about this in much more detail and takes it all the way to our day, what the meaning of Zion is. But my point is that Joseph Smith's concept of Zion evolved. He learned this through the translation work and then through his own experience. When the saints were driven out of Missouri, he understood Zion to then mean all of North and South America, and he taught that to the saints. Zion is not just one place, it's all of North and South America. And then later in his life, he reflected on that, and he said that Zion, he wrote Moses, the Lord called his people Zion because they were of one heart and one mind and dwelt in righteousness, and there was no poor among them. And in D&C 97, that's reflected when he says Zion is the pure heart. So Zion is a state of being. Zion is how we treat each other. Zion is not just a physical location, but Zion is something that we all do. And this definitely reflects in the way we look at the church today and the concept that we have of this. Here's what Joseph Smith said again. We ought to have the building up of Zion as our greatest object. When war shall come, we shall flee to Zion, and the cry is to make haste. And then this is what Richard Bushman said about Joseph Smith and Zion, which I think is super insightful. The city of Zion occupied a central place in Joseph Smith's design for world renewal. How many of you were Brother Millett's piece earlier, right? He talks about that really well. And he saw Joseph Smith's vision wasn't just to found a church. Joseph Smith's vision was to change the world, literally. That's what he says. Joseph Smith conceived the world as a vast funnel with the city at the vortex and the temple at the center of the city. Converts around the globe would be attracted to this central point and acquire knowledge and power for preaching the gospel. Then, trained and empowered in the temple, the missionary force would go back into the world and collect Israel from every corner. So they're flowing into Zion to get trained and buoyed up and learn everything they need to. And they go out as missionaries and gather all the elect everywhere they go. The city, the temple, and the world existed in a dynamic relationship. Missionaries flowed out of the city, converts poured back in. That exchange would redeem the world. So that's a really good concept about that. All right. Now, related to that, very related to the law of Zion, is the law of consecration. And understanding how this evolved in the church, again, is one of those really interesting transitions, and understanding how this impacted Joseph Smith himself. When he was doing the Moses translation, December 1830, as I already mentioned, they learned about Enoch City and all those things. One of the things that he learned was this phrase, and you can see it on here. Because they were of one heart and of one mind, right? And they dwelt in righteousness, and there was no poor among them. Right? You see this? So this is from the manuscript. There was no poor among them, is what he learned. And the Lord took care of them. He called them Zion because there was no poor among them. So, shortly after that, in January, he has this revelation, D.C. 38, where he says, where the Lord says, let every man esteem his brother as himself. Be one. If you're not one, you're not mine. And then look to the poor and needy and minister their relief, so that they shall not suffer. This first time this concept's come up in one of the Doctrine and Covenants revelations. And it came just days after he learned about Enoch City, and that's how they operated. So how is this going to be implemented in the church? Well, they'll find out. In early February, Joseph Smith arrives in Kirtland, Ohio, and he starts to meet the people there. Some of the saints in Kirtland who were already there had started something called the family, a communal situation where they were trying to live after the pattern the New Testament describes in the book of Acts and have things in common. It wasn't working very well, but they were working at it. They were trying to get there. And so they said, Joseph Smith, is this what we should be doing? On February 4th, he promised them that they would receive his law. The Lord promised that they would receive my law. And 5 days later, they receive it. Section 42 is the first version of the Law of Consecration. And it says in there, among other things, thou shalt consecrate all thy properties, and they shall be managed by the bishop. In fact, let me read this one to you from the original. It's different than section 42 today. So if you haven't dialed into the Joseph Smith papers, this is a good one. Go see what the original section 42 said, because it's very telling. If thou lovest me, thou shalt serve and keep all my commandments, and behold, thou shalt consecrate all thy properties, that which thou hast unto me, with a covenant and a deed which cannot be broken. And they shall be laid before the bishop of my church and 2 of the elders, such as he shall appoint, and set apart for that purpose. Every man shall be a steward over his property, or that which he hath received, that every man may receive according as he stands in need. So the idea was, everybody consecrates everything to the bishop, he's in charge, and then a couple elders that he chooses to help run the program. They then give a stewardship back to each of the people that had consecrated it, and the surplus goes to help the poor. That was the system that they set up. Now they tried to live this in Missouri. They learned the place for the city of Zion, as I talked about, and then, sorry, I skipped too far. They tried to live this in Missouri, and then it didn't work out very well, right? If you know the story, Missouri had a lot of difficulties there. So, this is what they learned. Wherefore, this is the land of promise and the place for the city of Zion. Behold, the place which is now called Independence is the center place, like in Joseph's vision, in the spot, for the temple lies near the courthouse. The history of the saints in Missouri, is something that is kind of sad, and we learned all of that. Their effort was paid off in a number of ways, however. We have to recognize that today the laws of consecration and stewardship are fundamental to the church. And though we don't live them like section 42 first outlined, which was the modern day implementation of the city of Enoch, the laws still apply when we go to the temple. When we make those covenants, the laws of consecration and stewardship are absolutely essential for us being able to run the church today. When I was, some years ago, I made friends with a rabbi who lives in my area, and we had a lot of interesting exchanges. I went to some of his meetings, he came to some of ours, because we can do that, right? Saturday, Sunday works really well. And we just, anyway, I enjoyed the friendship very much. And one of the things that he learned was how our church worked. And he would say, no, wait, so your bishop is not a full-time bishop. And I said, no, he's an insurance salesman. And he said, and all those other people, the Relief Society president, all these people, nobody gets paid for any of this. And I said, no, absolutely not. In fact, they're spending all the money. Nobody's getting paid. He said, how does that work? Because in my church, I'll form a committee, I'll see that we have a need, and I'll form a committee, and I'll ask for volunteers, and I get nobody. And then I'll reach out to people that I think would be good at that committee. I'll say, can you please help? And they'll say, well, okay, but then they don't do anything. How do you get that to happen? And I said, let me read you something called Section 42. And we talked about that, the law of consecration, how that works in the church, how that runs the church fundamentally. We accept callings, we do all these things that we do because we have that law. And it's something that nobody else has, and they know that they don't have it, and they miss it. They notice the difference when they look at how the church works, and that's a result of what Joseph Smith learned. All right, age of accountability. This is an example that Robert Matthews first pointed out a long time ago. So this is probably the most common one that people say, well, what's the thing that Joseph Smith learned? But there's an interesting twist that I wanted to bring to your attention. So they learned it when doing the work on Genesis in about February, March of 1831. It was an Abrahamic covenant, and they were expanding. Joseph Smith was having a revelation that expanded the Abrahamic covenant as part of Genesis 17. And he learned this right here. Well, before I say that, though, you know about small children in the Book of Mormon. When they're mentioned in the Book of Mormon, it says that little children are not accountable before God. Right? And Joseph had learned that from translating the Book of Mormon, but there's no age. What's a little child? When do they become accountable? Right? There's no age. And there was an early doctrine, comes from Revelation section 18, which also spoke about that, said that children are not accountable for the years of accountability, but didn't give the age. This is where he learns it. It's Genesis chapter 17. And you can see, trying to get it so I can show you. Thou mayest know that the children are not accountable before me until they're 8 years old. Maybe you see that? When they're 8 years old, that's when they become accountable. He learns that here. Now, in the context of this revelation, the Lord's teaching Abraham about circumcision, which happens at 8 days old. And he says that's a token of their ultimate accountability at 8 years old. And so that's how Joseph learned that principle through this revelation of Abraham. Now, if all we had was Genesis 17, we would still be wondering in the church when that was, because there was no doctrine comes from Revelation until section 68. In section 68, on November 1st, 1831, then the Lord told members of the church the following. And again, when parents have children in Zion that teach them not to understand the doctrine of repentance and faith in Christ, the Son of the living God, and baptism and gift of the Holy Ghost by laying on of hands when 8 years old, the sin be upon the heads of the parents. For this shall be the law unto the inhabitants of Zion. Notice how casually the Lord says that. The emphasis here is what parents are supposed to teach their children. And he says, when you teach your children to be baptized at the age of 8. Like, duh. You already know that. Well, Joseph Smith didn't already know that. He knew that a long time before this, several months before this. But this is the revelation where the church first learns it. Now, what I like about this is, then he goes on to learn in 1836, in the Kirtland Temple, Joseph Smith had a vision that he learned this very important topic. All children who die before they arrive in the years of accountability, which he knows is 8, are saved in the celestial kingdom of heaven. Joseph and Emma had 5 children that died very, very young. Some were stillborn, some died shortly after being born. 5 children. As I recall, it's the first 5. So Emma had 4 pregnancies, because 2 of them were twins. The 4 pregnancies, and she lost all the children. Right? This doctrine would have been very, very sweet to Joseph and Emma, to know that those 5 children were inheritors of the celestial kingdom. Something that they, would have brought great comfort to them, as it does to many people today. This is a doctrine that's unique to Latter-day Saints. Other people don't know this. When Joseph and Emma's first child died, when they were living in harmony, Emma's uncle told them that that child was damned to hell. Right? This is a very sweet doctrine, which is religious. Now, another kind of really obvious one, because it's right in the Doctrine and Covenants, is this one, the degrees of glory. On the 16th of February, 1832, Joseph Smith and Sidney were working through the New Testament. They'd reached John chapter 5. When they got to verse 29, they wrote it out. At this point in the translation, they would literally write every verse out, even if they didn't change anything. And so they wrote the entire verse 29 out, just the way it is in the Bible, and then they stopped. And they paused and looked at this and said, and they went and changed it. And so look at the manuscript. Right here. In. You see that? The word unto is crossed out and replaced with in. Then the word life is crossed out and replaced with the just. And then the word unto and in is again replaced. And then this word damnation is crossed out. Okay, is that working? Okay. But instead of writing the word above the line, the word is written here next to it. Unjust. There we go. See that? That showed they paused because they had room on the line next to it to write it. And that's exactly what's reflected in section 76. He says, for while we were doing the work of translation which the Lord had appointed unto us, we came to the 29th verse, the 5th chapter of John, which was given unto us as follows. And then he gives the new translation of it. section 76 continues, now this caused us to marvel, for it was given us of the Spirit. There's the Spirit working right there in the manuscript. As we meditated upon these things, the Lord touched the eyes of our understanding, and they were opened, and the glory of the Lord shone round about, and they had the whole vision of the 3 degrees of glory that we know so well, section 76. It's called the vision. That's what the early church called it. We call it section 76, but it's almost too bad. The vision is such a great name. The church saw this as absolutely revolutionary. This is brand new information no one had. Just stunning information. This caused such an impact on Joseph Smith that throughout his life, if you search on his letters and his sermons and other things, if you search on the terms that are within section 76, you'll find hundreds of hits. He reuses the language of the vision over and over again throughout his life. It was deeply impactful to him. He said later, as he was writing about this in his journal, nothing could be more pleasing to the saint upon the order of the kingdom of the Lord than the light which burst upon the world through the foregoing vision. This one. It witnesses the fact that the document is a transcript from the records of the eternal world, the sublimity of ideas, the purity of language, the scope for action, the continued duration for completion, in order that the heirs of salvation may confess the Lord and bow the knee. The rewards for faithfulness and the punishments for sins are so much beyond the narrow-mindedness of men that every honest man is constrained to exclaim, it came from God. So this had a very, very deep impact on Joseph Smith, this particular document. Now this one's kind of a fun one. The wheat and the tares. When they were doing Matthew 13, they first wrote this down with no changes. Frederick G. Williams was the scribe, Joseph Smith was writing it. There's not a change. They write it exactly as it is in Matthew 13:30 today. And then, if you look, in fact, let me go back and show you this real quick. Remember this? This is when they were working on the New Testament. They finished it right here, on July 2nd, 1832. And then they started editing, however. They went back to the Old Testament. So with Frederick G. Williams, Joseph Smith was working on the Old Testament, but with Sidney Rigdon, he was working on the New Testament edits. And they were going back through the New Testament manuscript and just kind of taking a second look at it and making changes. Sometimes the changes were relatively small. They would just cross out a word right above the line. Sometimes they're more extensive. On the more extensive changes, they would write them on a separate piece of paper and pin them. So, go back now. Here's what happens with this one. Right? They cross out the words in the manuscript. They pin this note to there. And the note pin changes the order of the wheat and the tares. In Matthew, the tares are gathered first and brought into bundles and then burned, and then the wheat's collected later. They reverse it. It says, gather ye together first the wheat into my barn, and the tares are bound in bundles to be burned. So first the wheat, then the tares. That's the change they made. So when did this happen? This is really interesting because we can date that now. Through the Joseph Smith papers, we learned Joseph Smith made this comment. Sorry. I went to skip the page. Here it is. On December 6, 1832, Joseph Smith personally wrote in his own journal, December 6th, translating and received a revelation, explained the parable of the wheat and tares. That comment in his history relates to section 86 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Section 86 explains the wheat and the tares. But section 86 was triggered by this editing exercise that he and Sidney Rigdon were doing. So this is written in Sidney Rigdon's hand. And what's really fascinating is section 86 is written in Sidney Rigdon's hand. Frederick G. Williams was his scribe at this point. Frederick G. Williams writes everything else. But section 86 is in Sidney Rigdon's hand because it was received while they were working on this. So again, this is a really interesting insight from Joseph's papers, how this happened. And the wheat and the tares, this very much influenced what was going on in the church at that time. This subtle change of gathering the wheat first fit perfectly with the missionary efforts that were going on in the church in those days. They were out there gathering the wheat, and Joseph was teaching them to gather the wheat, and the Doctrine and Covenants was calling them to gather the wheat. So this aligns with exactly what the Lord is having them do to prepare for the day of burning, which was coming, as section 45 and others talk about. Joseph Smith said this a couple years after this revelation. He was looking at Matthew, he was looking at his change that he'd made, and he was trying to make sense of it, and this is how he explained it. We understand that the work of gathering together the wheat into the barns, or garners, is to take place while the tares are being bound over and prepared for the day of burning. So the wheat may be first, but the tares are happening kind of at the same time, right? And all of it's coming together in the last days, and both are the harvest that we have to have in the last days. And then finally, this one on Israel and priesthood. The concept of priesthood is a really fascinating topic. And I was just talking with Mike McKay today, Michael McKay, and you know his work, he's done some really good work on the early history of the church. I highly recommend his books, right, on the Book of Mormon translation and on the seer stones and everything, Sacred Space, all of those are good. He's doing some work right now on the priesthood restoration and how that's evolving. As we were chatting about that, it was fascinating, so I'm folding that in here. Right? In May of 1829, John the Baptist and Peter, James, and John appeared to Joseph Smith and all of his cavalry and give them the priesthood, give them keys. The one I don't have on here is that in March of 1830, they have the upper room in the Whitmer home, and they have an experience where Peter, James, and John appear again and give them additional keys so they can organize the church in April. It goes on, in February of 1831, they were working on the translation of the Bible. So that's what they've received. They received priesthood keys, but now they're going to learn about it. In February of 1831, they're working in Genesis 14. And they learn this. Melchizedek was ordained a high priest after the order of the covenant which God made with Enoch, it being after the order of the Son of God. When they received the priesthood from Peter, James, and John, you'll notice in the early revelations the word Melchizedek priesthood doesn't appear. They didn't have that understanding. They had priesthood, they had keys, they had an apostleship they knew, but this whole idea of Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood is a much, much later development. So here's where they first learn about it. Melchizedek had this priesthood after the order of the Son of God through Enoch. And then about a year later, as you can see there, they were working in Hebrews, which also has a thing about Melchizedek, and they said, for this Melchizedek was ordained a priest after the order of the Son of God, which order was without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. And all those who are ordained unto this priesthood, this Melchizedek priesthood, are made like unto the Son of God, abiding a priest continually. Then in September of 1832, they're working through two sections of the Old Testament, Exodus, almost back to back, and Deuteronomy. These were just days apart. And they learned pretty much the same thing. The Lord says to Moses, hew thee 2 other tables of stone like the first. You remember Moses got 2 stones from the Lord, went down, found they were worshiping the golden calf, and broke it. Right? He goes back to get some more. The Lord says, hew 2 other tables of stone like the first, and I will write upon them also the words of the law, according as they were written at the first, on the tables which thou breakest. But it shall not be according to the first. For I will take away the priesthood out of their midst. Therefore my holy order and the ordinance thereof shall not go before them. So Joseph Smith learned the priesthood, there's a different priesthood, that the Aaronic priesthood was received by Aaron, but the other priesthood was withheld by them because of their choices. And then Deuteronomy gets more specific. He says that this priesthood which they lost is the words of the everlasting covenant of the holy priesthood. So now he's really learning a lot. All of this comes together in section 84, in this marvelous priesthood revelation of 84. And in that section, he says, he learns rather that Moses received the priesthood from Jethro, his father-in-law, who got it through a chain of ordinations down, including Melchizedek, all the way down to Adam, that this priesthood was called the holiest order of God. It's the greater priesthood, and without it, the ordinances and the power of godliness cannot be made manifest in the flesh. So section 84 is really when they start to learn about this Melchizedek priesthood and start to implement that in the church, September of 1832. Now, of course, all of this accumulated in a great priesthood understanding that led to the temple, that led to all kinds of things in Nauvoo, and the Lord taught all these truths to Joseph Smith initially through the Joseph Smith translation. Okay. I like this picture of Liz Lemon Swindle. I haven't asked her about this. I don't know, but I think she was trying to portray the moment when they received Section 76. Right? Sidney Rigdon is looking very anxiously. They're looking at a verse, and they're leaning over and going, what does that mean? They're pondering this. So I think that's what she was trying to represent. One of the reasons I wanted to put this up here was because that Bible's too small. This is Joseph Smith, not Joseph Smith's Bible. Let me say that again. This is just like Joseph Smith's Bible. The real one's in Independence, Missouri, in the Community of Christ Archives, but this is the same printing. And I found this a few years ago, and I just said, oh, I have to have that. So you can see what Joseph Smith was looking at, when he was translating John 5:29. That's not it. So you can see it, right in the book, and you can see what Joseph Smith's Bible looked like. He and Oliver Cowdery purchased this Bible in 1829 from Egbert B. Grandin's print shop for $3.75. And this is exactly what he was looking at. Though a little bit newer. It's 200 years old now, so it's a little delicate. But I like this picture because it shows the kind of experience Joseph was having in the Bible. And let me just end with this. And this is from the paper, so I apologize. I am going to read it because I think I wrote it better than I can say. The prophet Joseph Smith was a man who thoroughly engaged with the scriptures. He studied them intensely and sought revelation as he did so. His translation of the Bible was done by the Spirit of God, like the Book of Mormon translation, and is a model for how we study the scriptures and stimulate revelation in our own lives. As Joseph pondered the words on those sacred pages and asked questions that came to his mind, the Lord revealed answers to him. In his role as prophet of the Restoration, many answers impacted not only his own life, but the entire path of the church in the last days. While our own revelations may not have the same scope, they are nevertheless as personally significant. Studying the scriptures is a catalyst to personal revelation. An effort that we make to show the Lord that we seriously seek his voice, need his guidance, and desire to be a greater follower of righteousness and to possess greater knowledge. Joseph Smith demonstrated through his work on the translation of the Bible that such an effort is well rewarded. I bear my testimony of Joseph Smith as a prophet of God. What he did on the Bible was incredibly significant to him personally, and we're also the beneficiaries of it because we get to study what he learned and what he got out of it. And I'm so appreciative of his revelation and inspiration and his leadership in the last days. And grateful for everything he did for us in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.